Welcome to this wānanga. Tūturu is a space to hold robust and enlightening discourse, an in-depth, unapologetic and unforgiving wānanga, bringing together experts. Very rarely do we get the opportunity to have a proper wānanga about colonisation.
People don't like saying it now because we're supposed to get along and we're supposed to be polite. But the reality is those boats left Europe with white supremacy fueling their sails.
Today's Kaupapa, the law of the land. People often only look at our history as though it began when Pākehā arrived. But we lived here in Aotearoa long before the arrival of Europeans. This wānanga looks into the worldview of hapu and whānau before the arrival of European interruption. Our kai kōrero for this wānanga are Māori lawyers Dayle Takitimu and Kapa-Kingi, Māori research and advocate Tina Ngata, and Indigenous rights protector Te Ōtane Huata. E wama, there will be times in this wānanga where you might feel triggered. You might feel hoha, disgruntled, but hang in there. The only way to decolonise our minds is to understand colonisation. So strap in and let the wānanga begin.
Before Pākehā came here, our story starts a lot earlier than that in our creation stories and also our coming here from Hawaii and the connection to our Hawaii wānanga is our sort of, for me, like where I come from, like our source of truth, the puna of our mātauranga, and then the very deliberate migration here from Hawaii in a series of waves. What we know is that in Hawaii, and then when we arrived here, ki Aotearoa, we were self-governing people. We were fully possessed of our own rangatiratanga. We were able to make our own decisions. We were complete people in a complete society. And we often say, you know, we weren't sitting on the beach on the 6th of February 1840 waiting for some great salvation to come in a European boat and complete us. We were complete peoples. We had our own education systems, our own transfer of knowledge through generations that had occurred for many, many generations by then. We had our own justice systems. We had our own ways of regulating our social rules between us. We had our own family systems that were specifically architected and engineered in terms of the way the cohesion worked amongst us. So we weren't wanting for anything in terms of the completeness of who we were, and our tikanga sat as the law that held that together. And in law sense, I say LAW, not LORE, LAW. The tikanga regulated that as its own legal system. So yeah, I think there's some mythology that we were waiting to be civilised or completed, but that's just not consistent with our history.
Clear.
You know, one of the dominant colonial fictions is that we didn't have our own rationality. And attached to the idea that we couldn't be rational, you know, you can't govern yourself if you're not rational. And what are the things that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're rational with? It's all of those systems that colonisers claim to have introduced here. And in order for that fiction to hold up, they have to try and convince us or convince the world that it wasn't already here. So it's a functional fiction to say that we didn't have those systems, the judicial systems, the council systems. You know, the dominant colonial fictions are that we were warring and colonisation brought us peace, that we were even, you know, had an insatiable appetite for human flesh, and colonisation did that, you know, took care of that, and so that we couldn't self-govern and colonisation gave us forms of governance. There's a persistent colonial fiction that colonisation brought us trade, as if we couldn't trade, you know, ourselves. Or that also that it brought us an idea of transnationalism or internationalism. But obviously, like as time's gone by, we have debunked a lot of those fictions. We know that our tipuna traversed Te Wānanga. We know that they had transnational relationships. We know that they had, tikanga to guide how you engage with new people. When the Pākehā came, it was a new form of transnationalism. It was a new type of a transnational relationship, but that's not to say that we didn't manage our transnational relationships. We didn't have economies, that we didn't have all of those other things. We had all of those ways of managing it. We also had long-standing periods of peace and our own mechanisms for negotiating, establishing and maintaining peace that were, obviously profoundly upended through the arrival of colonisation. But all of those colonial fictions are, they're functional to legitimise the arrival of colonialism by saying that colonisation brought all of those social institutions that we already had.
I guess one of the ironies that's quite confronting as we're talking about this, our current reality comparing to the reality of our tūpuna, those things are worlds apart, and it's frustrating, infuriating that we can only really theorise and imagine the kind of world that our tūpuna lived in. Hakatangi te manawa. We don't know what that feels like. And we can only, yet. And we can, but the fact that we've been separated out of removed from ourselves and made unwhole, it makes it difficult to imagine. But I guess another way of looking at it, as opposed to asking kind of what was it like, how were our tūpuna, how did they live? Well, if we looked at our reality and think about kind of the things that weren't a part of their reality, or they weren't sick, they weren't criminal, they weren't poor, they weren't being locked up, they weren't having their babies taken away from them. So those are kind of the realities that we know as te iwi Māori. E ka hore e rā kino I Pāki ngā tūpuna, I noho rangatira rātou I roto I tō rātou ao. So just, I guess, that's what our mahi is closing that gap and almost kind of te hoki ngātu ki te ao ngā tūpuna.
I recall Matua Huirangi Waikirepuru, who I obviously defer to because I'm certainly no expert on anything tikanga. But I recall him saying, kawa wareware, ko te tikanga te mātāmua, te ture mātāmua tēnei whenua, ko te tikanga te tuakana, ko te ture te teina. And, I think too, like, how our people understood law in terms of a tikanga system, quite different from the way that they were making law out of Europe at that time and putting it on boat and coming here. In that world, your law doesn't have to be tika. There's no tika barometer for your law. It just has to pass through a set of a set of steps, procedural steps, and then it's considered law. That's exactly what's happening in New Zealand at the moment. You can pass any law you want through the Houses of Parliament as long as it follows the correct process. It'll get a stamp. Whether it is tika or not, whether it's in harmony with the taiao or not. Our tipuna never had that luxury, if it's a luxury. Our tipuna never had that option available to them because their ture had to be, their ture was the taiao. The taiao dictated their ture amongst them. And so those things were so closely connected that, like I would say, first arrival Pākehā were probably treated quite well because our tipuna recognised the tapu of a tangata. Even now, even when you're hoha with people, they'll require you to recognise he tapu tonu te tangata, but it's like on this other side of things, no, if they've passed a law to say that they can annihilate you or exterminate you because the law passed through those procedures, they'll consider it right. And I think that's very different world to be coming from, like a very different type of people create that.
Telling the world that settlers brought these great things to Aotearoa was a part of a tactic used to convince Māori that colonisation wasn't such a bad thing. These narratives have been etched into our minds for many generations. But if for a moment we cast our imagination to before Pākehā arrived, we arrived here to the middle of nowhere at the bottom of the world before maps, motors and Google Earth. It's still one of the greatest achievements ever.
There was an intentionality and a deliberateness about how certain of those migrations and those waka journeys set out from Hawaii in terms of the construction of our societies here and the way we settled our lands here. And I think that's really important to keep a hold of, like that there was definite deliberateness in the way our people led each other. We were strategic people. Things weren't happening by accident. We were definitely trying to intentionally plan what our current and future societies would need. And again, I think we're repetitively in that space, even through the interruption, I would say, of colonisation, because I like to think of it more as an interruption than a breaking of us. I don't think I'll ever concede that it's broken us. It's interrupted us, it's caused an inordinate amount of violence to us, and as our tuakani o whanaunga moana used to say, colonisation being a violence upon the soul of a people. What we have seen time and time again is people reduce that experience to a series of transactions that went wrong in this great nation building experience. But they don't stop and say, but where was the consent of the people to be subjected to a system of colonisation that we never fully consented to by any stretch. And I think those kind of ideas about how we can repair the violence to the soul, and we can still, I guess, being in these decolonial spaces and anti-colonial spaces, you kind of have to be an optimist to some extent and hope that there's a way for us to piece that interruption and that violence back together, and that it's not all lost. And I do think, we were speaking about it earlier, that kind of tuning fork within us, really for me, is a DNA call. I think that we are, te kākono iru ia mai, and there's, we can dial back into that, we can plug back into that. We're not at all minimising the amount of systemic violence our people have been subjected to, but the fact that we can restore ourselves, I think, is infinitely possible.
It's so hard to see beyond all of the awful things that have been inflicted on us as a people. So much trauma still exists. The impacts of these things are long-lasting, and we've been massively affected by colonisation. But our connection with our taiao and our lands has never wavered as tangata whenua of this land.
Often people ask about, or talk about definitions of indigeneity, and one of the definitions of indigeneity that has really carried me through a lot of scenarios, setting aside the definition that sits in relation to colonialism and setting aside also some of the political definitions around it, it's the idea of a way of knowing, being, doing and relating to each other that stems out of the soils that you're standing on and the waters that surround you. And it's through the people who have the long-standing relationship to the soils that you're standing on and the waters that surround you that are able to carry that indigeneity and carry those relationships and the tikanga that comes out of that taiao and the ways of knowing, being, doing, relating, leading that come out of that taiao. When you think about colonial systems, it's actually a mere drop. It's like 255 years. And it's done, it's done its fair share of damage here in relation to us being Indigenous to these soils and these waters. That's up against 1,000 years, and so when that's actually they're the radicals, We're more conservatives, and that's what Māori used to say, we're the conservatives. We're trying to conserve a way of being that comes out of this very soil. We're the ones
The
that are
pace
trying
of
to
changes.
conserve that. They're the ones that came along with a radical way of being from somewhere else and tried to introduce it here, and it's created quite a mess in that time. But, you know, our relationship to this place stems back at least 1,000 years, arguably going by our oral traditions, he mokopuna no pānia, no we pōhatu, you know. So if you look at those traditions, then it goes back a much longer period of time. Now we're still here, that soil's still here, those waters are still here, the rest of it that's in between us all is just white noise. You know, so there's nothing... Literally white noise. So there's nothing to stop us from, you know, plugging into that relationship. It's not irrevocably broken. It's there. It's just creating the time and the space and the intentionality around plugging back into that relationship.
The democratic process here in Aotearoa is flawed. It always has been. When you look at history and the rules that have kept Māori from having a voice, based off age, gender and land ownership, is absolutely heartbreaking. And it is still happening today. But if this is flawed, what did it look like before?
People talk about, well, this is inevitably the system we've got, we're just got to make good of it now. And to remember, it's been here blink of an eye.
Yeah.
And we can flip it that quickly if we're minded to do that. The way decisions and power was held in the time of our tipuna, one that stretched a massive period of time, so it would have been shifting and changing, but I think kei ia muka tā rātou ake tikanga. Koena te mea tino pono ki au, because each person was or each place and collective was really governed by their taiao. And it was really the taiao that was the big boss of everybody. And we were lower on the food chain and subject to the way that the taiao dictated seasonally how things worked, food cycles, weather cycles, maramataka, those sorts of things, but also in terms of our whakapapa and our whakapono, coming from our innate connection to those tipuna and to those atua. So in that regards, I mean, I suppose everybody would have, I think there's no absolutism about the way things were. We know in some of our own areas through our own history and our own oral tradition how people did it and would have done it back in the days. What we do know, and certainly in our neck of the woods and the East Coast, is that people were making collective decisions for the benefit of the collective, and they were doing that in a way that kept them in harmony with the taiao. On top of that, I guess there would be nuanced other ways of doing things, and you might have an esteemed rangatira in some places, or a tohunga in some places, or komiti whakahaere in some places that might exercise some of those kōrero decision-making powers, but the big framework for that was the taiao, and that in fact determined how decisions needed to be made, not just how decisions were in fact made, but how they needed to be made for the ongoing survival of our people.
Yeah, I think definitely when I think about the differences from then and the challenges that we have under colonial systems and how that differs to what is just the deep reverence, inescapable and non-negotiable reverence for our taiao, for our atua who are our taiao, and the deep understanding of our interconnectedness as well and our interdependability upon that, and the humility in the face of our taiao, of our atua who were also our taiao as well. Not the sense of domination and the sense of authority over the taiao, or trying to force the taiao to your will.
Actually, on that kōrero about our atua, seeing some iwi having more reverence for specific atua in those spaces, because those are the ones that provided them with the nutrients. So if we look at Te Whānau Apanui, there's more appreciation for te kete o te moana. If we look closer to that inwards tūhoi, there's more of appreciation to tāne mahuta, because those are the things that provided us with sustenance. And when we look at Ngāti Kahungunu, we are io matua kore, because te wakatapu o Takitimu was a tapu, wakatapu o Takitimu. And so those knowledge systems were carried from tumu te wharo to that space. And so it's really interesting just looking across that there's no one rule.
And I think it would be hard to find it because we were autonomous nations in our own right by the time of Pākehā got here. And that not necessarily how we arrived from Hawaii, but then how the settlement and the cross kind of pollination occurred after that. Like I would say in Apanui, yes, we have multiple connections and multiple atua in those spaces. I suppose if you're talking in terms of atua Māori, then, but I'd say in terms of tangaroa, the proximity of our whakapapa determines that. And so we really lean into that because we see ourselves as mokopuna of tangaroa. Or you're going to make certain decisions in relation to the moki, to the kahawai, because they're interconnected with you. You say that outside of an Apanui space or outside of an Indigenous space, people think you gone to rangi tūhaha and kari mo te hoki mai. But you know, when you say there's this interrelationship, whakapapa interrelationship between us, but that's our part of our creation story and what we know to be our truth. And yeah, I think that then distills down through the generations that then descend from it. So then we have our unique ways of doing things. And I think, again, the sameness is part of the colonial trap. Even this idea that we were Māori. It's a colonial fiction, really.
Dayle has made a really important point here. One worth explaining a bit, because we don't often talk about it. Before we were considered Māori, one peoples, we lived as independent hapu and whānau. We had unique ways of working. We acknowledged different atua. We weren't just one people. How could we be? We were scattered all across the country with different environments and different scenarios.
Between us, we can have a kotahitanga or an alliance about what we think Māori is, but that's quite different from the insisting upon that unified label from a colonial point of view, to deny you your apanuitanga, your kahununutanga, those sorts of things, because we were self-governing or self-determining in our own right as our own nations at the time that the Pākehā arrived, you know, on these shores. We've seen that. Te whakaputanga will show you that. Our histories will also play that up. And I think that's important to hold on to the fact that we are uniquely and innately different. Yeah, I mean, I guess I come from a worldview where I think the Indigenous of this world have a unique contribution to make. We should hold on to the uniqueness of that and not have it in a generic space. And I caution against the idea of a generic kind of view of history, but also a view of how we were or how we will be. Because I don't think kotahitanga means sameness. I think kotahitanga means we can have our own distinctness in that space.
So he pātai tāku ki a koe, do you still hold the same beliefs about the title of Māori nowadays?
When it's been imposed on us from other people or been used to describe us, yes. When we adopt it and we use it for a particular descriptor of ourselves, to me that's an exercise of our mana. We can do that. We can describe ourselves any way we want to. But when it's imposed on us to say Māori are this, or here's a solution for Māori about this, or we're going to address the Māori issues like that, I think that's inherently problematic because that's not how our societies were organised. That's a convenience factor for a coloniser.
It's an imperialism, it's a tool of imperialism.
We'll gather you together. And we see that in lots of different ways, you know, that we'll probably talk about in terms of treaty justice, in terms of large natural groupings. You know, and the government of the day will sell that as it's administratively convenient. What it is for them is a redefinition of their treaty partner, which is grossly problematic. But also, we're not here. We haven't been put on this earth, and our tapu, our mana, our ihi has not been put on this earth to be administratively convenient for a coloniser. That's not why I'm here.
Te tiriti is administratively inconvenient for them.
All
Justice
of it's
is administrative.
Justice is not convenient for them. So I say when it's an exercise of our self-determination, to use a term like Māori, he pai tēnā. It's an exercise of our mana. We can do that.
Same with the
Just
term
how we
Indigenous.
say, oh, we're taiao or we're rangatahi or whatever. Those are descriptors we can put on ourselves. When somebody else is doing it, to diminish the visibility of your rangatiratanga underneath that, ko hera wātu.
Yeah, it's interesting te la kōrero. One of the earliest records, at least according to Ngāpuhi, of the use of te la kōrero te iwi Māori was a letter written by Taiwhanga in about 1825, who was writing to Marsden for trade because our tupuna were commercially savvy and driven and wanted to build different enterprises across their whenua, their rohe. Anyway, the substance of the letter was to do with trade, but that was one of the first records of the use of the word te iwi Māori, and that was being used by Taiwhanga in addressing Marsden and the kōrero. And I guess for me, the birth of te iwi Māori as a term is circumstantial, really. Like it was born out of the need to kind of differentiate us from Pākehā. And that in itself makes sense to me. Ka hore au e ki he kinotera, but yeah, tikana tō kōrero whanaunga, the use of that, the weaponization of that against us is what's damaging, and what's come from that as well. The colonizers created this sort of false competition between our Māoritanga and then our iwitanga, and saying that sort of one comes at the cost of the other. But we need to flip, I think, our tirohanga. Ki oku whakaro, I'm Ōpōri because I'm Māori, and I'm Māori because I'm Ōpōri. And all of these things and all of these strands of our identity can and must coexist and actually co-enforce too, because katoa I ahu mai I tō tātou ao Māori me te noho hei Māori ki tēnei whenua. And that false competition that's been created is really just another divide and conquer tactic, no reira. Me kaua tātou e hoko I tērā inu.
Now that we have a slight understanding of how things could have looked before European arrival, what happened once they arrived?
Well, they was broke when they got here. Homeless, paru, horeko, moni,
smelt them
horeko.
before we saw them.
Exactly. And it was by the grace of our tūpuna that they survived from the first arrivals of Pākehā. It was just funny because the narrative is that we're the savages and we were unwashed and we're pohara, dumb, sick, all of those things.
It's the Goldie, eh?
Yeah.
It's the Goldie that shows us as the ones that, barely made it here, but
Desperate.
It seems like they were the ones that barely made it themselves.
And that's part of the mythology, obviously, that we were required civilization. That I think there's a question mark whether anyone ever requires civilization from somebody else, but that's part of the mythology built by at that time, the Catholic Church, really, around the idea that we needed to be acquired. And really, to be frank, we were inconvenient, again, with the inconvenience of us. We were inconvenient because really it was a territorial expansion that people were after in terms of the building of empires and the really, what I would say, a whole generation of politics that was fueled on the back of greed and the idea of the acquisition of power at all costs, quite in competition to the way our tipuna describe their living in harmony with their world.
So, just to get this straight, on one hand, you had hapu, whānau, Māori, whose connection to the taiao determined all of their decisions, which stems from their reliance on their environment for survival. And then on the other hand, you had a group of settlers who shaped their decisions on the belief that they were naturally superior to native peoples, divinely entitled to dominate over land and the people of the land, and were committed to expanding across the globe in a project of conquest. These are two opposite ends of the spectrum.
It was inevitable there was going to be a clash of ideas and a clash of agenda and a clash of ideologies between Indigenous people living in harmony and within the abundance and seeing themselves as part of the taiao, not separate from it or masters from it. That idea of dominion over land came through other non-Indigenous doctrines, not ours, but this idea that we were part of the taiao, we are part of the taiao, and in fact, quite junior parties to the taiao in that space, whakapapa-wise, but we're we're living in that space, quite literally down in a pocket in the bottom of the South Pacific, uninterrupted really until that point. And along comes somebody who's running an agenda, a great greed race out of Europe. And really across the world globally, we've been, not just us, our other Indigenous relations and other Pacific nations everywhere have been subject to the violence and greed that came out of that era. But that there would be a clash of ideologies, I think historically now is not surprising to us. I think problematically the British Crown came in here with covering that with lies and this veneer of respectability and this idea of gift wrapping what otherwise was supposed to be our annihilation. They tried to gift wrap that in this idea of partnership that still 184 years later, they're still trying to sell us. But really their agenda when they came here was to acquire the territory and they were going to do that by any means possible. And the natives on top of it were inconvenienced, so they just fabricated a whole lot of doctrines that would give themselves permission to do terrible things to us, conquer us, kill us, strip us of everything, strip us of our dignity, strip us of our lands, our territories, our children, and then justify themselves in partnership with us about how we're going to restore ourselves to now be citizens of the nation they've brought in. So yeah, that was a problematic time in 1835, 1840, when the Pākehā arrived and manufactured that. They were selling something that historically has been shown to be really, really dishonest. And I would say I don't know that they ever had any intention of being honourable towards us. I don't think I could find any evidence for that historically.
Let's rewind just a little bit. You may have heard Dayle speak about the doctrine. She's talking about the Doctrine of Discovery, a social philosophy based upon a series of Roman Catholic laws and decrees by multiple popes and monarchs from the 15th to the 17th century. The Doctrine of Discovery is pretty much a set of guidelines from the Vatican and monarchs who were pushing the idea that their Christian authority was greater than any other, which gave them the right to invade. It was specifically created to drive global expansion. I highly recommend reading up on it e wama.
You know, looking at 1769, there's kōrero there around the state within which they washed up, the state that they were in, and then consistently from 1769 through to 1840, so many records of our tipuna being quite shocked at their behaviour, quite shocked at their beliefs and at the systems that they had with each other. And it's so interesting, you know, like when you raise that idea of savagery, particularly, you know, savagery couched as this, you know, an inability to be rational, an inability to act with mana, really, and a complete inability to act with mana that was observed repeatedly. And I believe that's what set the context for them saying, you know, something needs to be done about these people and their behaviour. I don't know that I completely pity to the idea that there were certainly designs about us, but the designs that had been established through the Doctrine of Discovery is that we were extensions of the land that was being claimed. The claim was put over the lands and the waters, and it's in the text, you know, it's your lands, it's your waters, it's your possessions, it's your dominions, your principalities, and that you can commit those people to perpetual servitude. So the people of the lands came with the land as a part of an extension of the land, and what was, what was laid claim to was all of it.
I think that's so important to acknowledge, because people don't like saying it now because we're supposed to get along, and we're supposed to be polite about putting this country back on track and facing its constitutional issues. But the reality is those boats left Europe with white supremacy fueling their sails. They treated the brown of this earth, the black and brown of this earth, as available to them to exploit, to kill, to enslave, to rape. And that's been throughout history, this entitlement, this white entitlement to us. And until we're really going to be honest about that, and I know people don't like the language because honestly, white people / Pākehā people, they're not used to being collectivized like that. So they don't like being called white. But we've been called Māori, and it's the same thing. It's a label about collectivity. But until we can address that and address the very foundations that those whakaaro that those boats set out from Europe with, all of them, whether they came from France, whether they came from Spain, whether they came from England, they all saw themselves as entitled to rule over us, to rule over our people and our ancestors. And that's, at its crux, the most deeply problematic whakaaro in humanity. And so us in New Zealand, there's in Aotearoa nei, whether you go to Australia, Canada, America, around the world, we're all going to have to wrestle with that truth. And we're still stuck in an era where it's considered not polite to say it. And if we can't even say it, we're not even allowed to say the words, that system is based on white supremacy. It absolutely is. It's based on the idea that white people are superior to everybody else. Until we can say that, not just as Aotearoa here, but globally, until we can say that and own that, we're not going to really confront the way that power is thwarted globally.
And, nā whaia no koera te tuāhuatanga o te Pākehā I taua wā. They had 500, or at that point 300 or more years of all of those entitlements sitting within their systems, the idea of the social contract and the laws and the everything that from when they had come from had been built upon these ideas of entitlement, these ideas of supremacy, which you can only have ideas of supremacy if the counterpart of that is an idea of inferiority. If you are supreme, that means somebody else is inferior, and that inferiority is also functional to legitimise me treating you however I want to treat you.
So that was perhaps taken from the class system that they had, and just generations and generations, centuries of just being totally pushed down.
Even the construction of the class system was deliberate by some people to hold power and control over others. It's been inequitable since the beginning, and I would say, to be honest, when you separate yourself and your power from a whakapono or connection to an authority in the land, and you start thinking you're the masters of the universe and start writing yourself documents that talk about your dominion over things, it's quite a different worldview than I tipu ake te pono I te whenua. And this idea that your mana, your whakapapa, your tapu is intrinsically connected, not just with the whenua, but by extension, the taiao. And so, even the class system there, it was pedo before they put it on the boat.
And so I'm just thinking, you've got all of this entitlement leaving the boat to when you arrive, and as the tuakana was talking about, they needed us to survive because they weren't acclimatised to the space, and without the good grace of our people, they would not have survived. Without the resources of our people and the manaakitanga of our people, they would not have survived here. And just on Kōrero Whaia Tina was just talking about the accusation of savagery, and I'm always one to, when the coloniser take from the colonial playbook, they every accusation is an admission. So we know that when they came over, their tactics were dog-like, were basically taking without any return. And we know that if we did that ourselves, and actually we hark back these practices to hundreds of thousands of years ago, we knew that if we didn't give back to our taiao, we wouldn't survive. we saw when they took from the taiao, they didn't give back, and so that would lead to the degradation not only of the whenua, but by extension, us as well as the people. So I think that's part of the trauma that we still carry today, is the destruction of our whenua, the not giving back of that rawa back to our whenua as well.
Yeah, I'd like to. I'd really like to get in a time machine and observe that period between 1769 and then through to the signing of Te Tiriti, which is 60 odd years, where actually the balance of influence was still in our favour, and where Pākehā would have been living under our authority as te iwi Māori, because things didn't start to shift until the 1850s. During that period, I think the highest population of Pākehā was 2,000 people, whereas Māori were upwards of around 80,000, possibly more. That dynamic there, just if you think about it as a numbers game kind of thing, obviously Pākehā would have been careful where they put their foot during that time, right? Even though there were some lawless whalers and sailors coming into Kororareka at the time, who brassed off the likes of Honeheke and Mai Tupuna of Ngāpuhi, it would be just interesting to see kind of how Pākehā would have behaved in that time. And and also I kind of think to myself, it would be nice if we kind of had that now, in terms of Pākehā being conscious of our tikanga, because they would have had to be at that time. Even though ka nana ki etahi taima ki te tāhai whenua, i te mutunga iho, ko te ringa kaha o te whenua, ko te tikanga Māori, ko ngā iwi me ngā hapu.
Interesting about those ones that came here, and they actually chose te iwi Māori, blended in with hapu Māori, ka koe te reo Māori, and then they actually became, without the whakapapa, but became part of Māori community. They chose that life over the oppressive class system instead.
Dispelling colonial narratives is one of the biggest steps towards Indigenous liberation. The fact that we are still here is powerful, but also Indigenous input is going to be integral if we're wanting a nice planet for our tamariki to live in, because no one has a better connection with it than we do. Thank you for listening in on this wānanga. Very rarely are we sitting together and talking about these things. Sometimes they are hard points to hear. Sometimes we feel more empowered when we do hear it, because through all of the devastation that has come our way, we are a small peoples who have never lost hope.